Okay, so I'm Kimberly. I'm a data scientist with PedsNet, which is a national network in the United States of pediatric healthcare institutions which standardize its data to an OMOP CDM. And this project really was and continues to be a collaboration with many people at the Data Coordinating Center for PedsNet, kind of our collective experience with working with some chart review and CDM data. So in the research landscape, chart review is often regarded as the gold standard for validation in retrospective cohort studies. But in PedsNet, we found that as we've completed around a dozen studies that have involved a chart review component, we've been led to challenge this assumption and wanted to set out to really dive into how can we leverage using chart review data and CDM data to play to both of their strengths. So we chose to focus in on two studies that we've completed with PedsNet that included a chart review component. One of which was a safety surveillance study in which the CDM was used to focus in on patients who had received a certain medication, and then we used chart review to validate the dose that they had gotten and also look at adverse events attributed to that medication. And the other study that we reviewed was a clinical trial in which the PedsNet CDM was used to apply inclusion criteria to figure out who might meet criteria for this study. And then chart review was used to validate inclusion criteria. So for both of these studies, we looked into instances where something that we got from the chart review didn't agree with something that we saw in the PedsNet data in the OMOP CDM. And we classified those types of discordance in order to help identify strengths and propose guidelines for using chart review data. So for both of these studies, we captured chart review data through a REDCap case report form that the chart reviewers at each of the institutions would fill out. And then at the PedsNet Data Coordinating Center, we took a look at the information that we were getting from that REDCap database and did some validation work with comparing against PedsNet data or making sure certain values that we saw in that case report form were sensible. And we especially focused in on some of the high importance data elements for each of those studies, which could be drug dosing and diagnoses and lab results. So the whole adjudication process for figuring out what the source of truth was in these studies really was set out of the PedsNet Data Coordinating Center, but we have the advantage in the PedsNet network of being able to communicate with the ETL analyst and with the chart reviewer. And we kind of had this iterative process of identifying what the issues were, but then being able to reach out to, in different situations, identifying who to reach out to, whether it be the ETL analyst or the chart reviewer, to have them look back at the source data or look back at the ETL code to help us identify what the source of the issue was. So as we reviewed each of these studies, we looked at each of the instances of discordance and we recorded certain information about each of them. So for example, what domain was impacted? What process did we follow to figure out what the source of truth was? And then ultimately, was the CDM or the chart review correct? And as we were evaluating each of these instances of discordance, we were able to classify them into common themes. And we piloted this approach on these two studies, but as we review more of the studies that we've completed, we anticipate that we'll be able to add on to these themes. So the three that we have so far: incorrectness, missingness, and mistranslation. So the first theme that we focused on was incorrectness. So this was an erroneous value either in the chart review data or in the CDM. So for example, in the chart review, that might mean a typo into the case report form. And in the CDM, that might mean a mismapping of units. And this frequency, that shows the number of times that this discordant information turned out to be incorrect for that source. So there were 24 instances where chart review was deemed incorrect. And I will note that this looks like there are 49 instances where the CDM was incorrect, but one of the things that we're noticing with the errors in the CDM are that a very small ETL fix could impact a high volume of records. So for example, this was just one mismapping of units, but it led to about 30 instances of discordance. The second theme that we focused on was missingness. So this is information that was either not in the source or was overlooked. So for example, in chart review, this arose when a chart reviewer was not able to exhaustively search the entire medical record and might have missed something that after we reached out to them, they were able to find in a location that they hadn't looked before. And in the CDM, this occurred due to latency. So we get our ETL or our data submissions once a quarter. And so there is some latency with the data that we're looking at in the CDM. And in some instances, the chart reviewer was able to go into the chart and find more recent information. The third theme that we focused on was mistranslation. So this was either error in the logic or interpretation of a question. So for example, a chart reviewer might impose some clinical judgment when they're filling out the form. And in the CDM, there might have been some query logic that we imposed that didn't take into consideration a situation like, for example, a patient having 2 consecutive visit occurrences and us only focusing on the first one. So through evaluating all these instances of discordance, we were able to kind of lay out some strengths and limitations of each of these data sources and concluded that we can't always hold one of these as the gold standard, but we really need to play to their strengths when we're setting out to do a study with either of them. So we found that the CDM was especially useful for dealing with large volumes of information and being able to apply a uniform definition across all of that information. And this kind of is a limitation of chart review as well, because there's a manual process that's time intensive for a chart reviewer to be able to extract this information. But there are benefits to chart review, such as being able to really focus in on one instance in a patient's medical record and supplement that with contextual information and being able to call out what might be an error in the source by looking around and seeing what else is going on with the patient at that time. Yeah, so some of our takeaways are, like I said, every information source has its strengths and limitations. So you should really take a strategic approach to looking at either of them and apply some data quality measures to make sure that the information that you're looking at is fit for use for whatever study purpose. And then another key takeaway, it always takes collaboration and communication to be able to figure out what the source of truth is. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.